Welcome to Talking Business, a podcast produced in Melbourne, Australia. The podcast is available on the Acast site, my own website, the Apple Podcast Store, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Or you can get it at the Business Acumen website at www.businessacumen.biz. I am Leon Gettler. My job is to review and monitor the week's news in business, finance and economics. I bring it all to you every week. For the most exclusive access to leading economists and business leaders from around the world, subscribe to Talking Business from my website, leongettler.com, or whatever your favourite podcast platform is. This is episode number 31 in our series for 2025, and today's date is Friday, September the 12th. First, I'll be talking to Francis Prince Thangasamy, the Managing Director for Asia Pac of Lumen Technologies. We'll talk about how Lumen helps companies digitise now and remain relevant despite market conditions, and the big challenge of addressing cybersecurity. And I'll be talking to independent economist Saul Eslake about what we can expect from the government's tax and productivity roundtable. But first, let's talk to Francis Prince Thangasamy. Well, Francis, tell us about Lumen.
Lumen is a global technology company that digitally connects people, data, and applications quickly, securely, and effortlessly. So what do I mean by that? So we own about 400,000 kilometers of fiber, connecting over 2,200 public and private data centers globally, and is one of the most peered networks. So along with that connectivity, we have our edge and cloud capabilities where customers run their applications, their workloads, and we help to manage and secure all of that for the customers. So on a day-to-day, we typically help organizations to modernize their connectivity, their platforms, and security posture required for the applications to operate safely.
So how many countries do you operate in?
Globally, 60 over. In Asia Pac, about 14 countries right now.
Right, you're the Managing Director for Asia Pac.
Yes.
Yeah. So you'd be fairly busy in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I got the responsibility to manage the strategy. Our customers are global in nature, talking to customers, and looking at solving business problems for them, and overall being responsible for customer experience. Yeah, definitely. It makes the job exciting.
Yeah. There's been lots of talk of difficult economic times. So how important is it for companies to digitise now?
I think regardless of market conditions, organizations will transform. I think COVID disproves that to all of us. If you look at most organizations, COVID drove transformation. The companies realize quickly how important it is to transform and remain relevant. So regardless of market conditions, I think organizations need to enable business and drive efficiency. And also transformation in the day has many purposes. Some of them is to drive efficiency, could be cost savings, could be enablement of new features, focusing on the business. So it really depends how much dependency the business has on digital infrastructure. And based on our recent understanding, I think Gartner did a study, and we're also seeing some good growth in IT spend in Australia. So that's continued focus.
I'd imagine digital infrastructure would be absolutely critical for every business.
Yep, definitely.
So who are the main customers of Lumen? I mean, which sectors do you appeal to?
Today, we have most of our customers are global in nature. So the multinationals, we serve all verticals. So we have financial, BFSI, we have organizations in agriculture, in retail, e-commerce, different various sectors, logistics, supply chain.
Do you also serve the public sector as well?
Not so much within the region. Within the region, we're focused a lot more on enterprises.
But outside the region, you would, in other parts of the world, you would?
It's in North America, because we are headquartered it's an American company headquartered in North America. So we do quite a lot of federal business in North America.
So what are the challenges for companies embracing digital transformation? I mean, I'd imagine it'd be quite difficult for some.
Yeah, prioritization, I think, is the biggest challenge, because you see companies, you have dependency on IT for different aspects. There are companies that are depending on IT for to enable the business to drive efficiency, but you also have organizations which are heavily e-commerce driven, and IT is what's driving the business for you. So how do you prioritize all of that? So in terms of challenges, so prioritization of budget, prioritization of resources, how do you serve your business at the same time modernize your infrastructure, and how do you get the skill sets? Skill sets is another challenge, quite common problem globally, and especially in certain areas like security, modernization of applications. So all of that has got challenges that companies have to work towards.
That would mean not only training their workers, but actually bringing in experts as well.
Right. I think there are some companies that would, given the scale, they like to do it in-house. So they finding the right skill sets could be a challenge. So what most organizations we are seeing doing is complementing what they have internally from a training perspective, and also embracing, and leveraging, expertise from, partners, providers outside the organization to help them.
But that would take up a fair bit of space, management space, wouldn't it?
Correct. You have to. It depends. Sometimes you work with partners to help modernize your applications, your workloads. But then you don't really need that much of. You can leverage your resources to focus on more internal projects. So this is how you leverage when you have a shortage of skill sets and resources, conflicting priorities from business units. So how do you serve all of them? So that's where you have to leverage the expertise in the industry.
But you would have to actually start recruiting to do that.
When you work with partners, you don't really have to have, you don't have to recruit a huge amount of team to do that, because you're leveraging your partners to do it.
Right, but you would also have to have a lot of internal education going on inside the organization.
Right. Agreed. So you need to have a strong program management capabilities, people who can bridge external partners and internal business units to understanding the common business problems and solving the business problems.
That would actually require not only the attention of management, but it would also require the attention of boards as well.
It depends on what scale. Definitely now, these days, the boards are more involved in projects and approvals of such projects, not just from a budget cost perspective, but also from a compliance, from a security and involvement in the business, correct? So yeah, we have seen some depends on the scale and the nature of the projects, I would say.
But obviously, security is now the key issue now, isn't it?
Right. And boards definitely would want to play a bigger role or be more involved in decisions around it.
Well, cybersecurity is now the huge issue, isn't it?
Definitely. We focus quite a bit on cybersecurity because of the insights that we have on our networks, which is one of the most peered networks. So a lot of internet traffic routes through our network. So with that and managed security services capabilities, we do help organizations to modernize the security posture. The biggest problem that a lot of companies that I've noticed talking to, they've all invested in various different security tools, but then it's very difficult to bring all of that together, and then you end up creating blind spots. So this can become a big issue for a company where you've invested so much money, but then you still have blind spots. So how do you bring all of that together in a single pane of glass? But then, so that's one problem. And identifying strong security talent is also another issue. There's a huge demand in the market globally. So that's why, and threats will always be there. It's how well organized and prepared you are. How do you detect, prevent first, and then how do you detect it quickly, and then how do you react to it is very important. So it's a big top of mind for most organizations.
Well, the other top of mind issue would be actually finding the talent, the cybersecurity talent, isn't it? Because there's a huge demand for that globally.
Correct. That's a big challenge. I've seen what some companies are doing is getting involved in campus recruiting, training people from a young internal training programs, and competing in the market to identify top talents. But definitely that's a big priority for most companies, finding talent.
Right. So where do you see the way forward for Lumen over the next 5 years?
We'll continue to work with customers along the same lines, modernizing customers' workloads, applications. We'll continue to grow the presence within the region, and as we do want to be a trusted advisor for companies in modernizing their applications and their workloads and their networks. So that's where I think we'll continue to focus on. We are doing quite a bit on security, so you'll see quite a lot of focus on cybersecurity within Asia Pacific and in Australia.
Okay, so cybersecurity will be a major issue over the next 5 years.
Definitely.
Well, Francis, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Leon. Great talking to you.
And now let's talk to independent economist Saul Eslake. Well, Saul, what was your take on the Productivity and Tech Summit?
I think it was worth doing. I know a lot of people have dismissed it as a talk fest, and I can see why they say that, but I think it did three things that were worth doing. One, it has put productivity front and centre of the agenda for the Albanese government's second term in a way that their election campaign could not have done, because the election campaign, like the Albanese's first term of government, was all about the cost of living, often depicted as a crisis. And that crisis is I think, for the most part, over. I mean, prices haven't gone down, reversing the increases that occurred as we were coming out of COVID. But real wages are now rising, at least for the time being. Tax is taking a smaller bite out of people's incomes, and interest rates are starting to come down. And the economy is, I think, gradually turning the corner. But the key point is that in the absence of a sustained boost to productivity, the improvements in people's living standards are going to be so small and slow that it will feel like the cost of living crisis hasn't ended. And the government needs to be thinking about how to improve Australia's productivity performance if it's to offer any prospect to the vast mass of people that things will ultimately get better, which, after all, political parties need people to believe in order that they have faith in them. So putting productivity front and centre of the government's agenda for the next 3 years, I think, was important. Although, of course, it remains to be seen how much they deliver on that. The second thing is that I think it has sped up the prospect of a number of relatively small steps that will nonetheless make some tangible difference to Australia's productivity performance within a reasonably short period of time. And in saying that, I'm thinking about things like reducing red tape in the construction sector, suspension of the National Construction Code for a few years, speeding up environmental approvals that are delaying housing and other important projects, having a serious conversation about how to pay for roads, knowing that fuel excise is ultimately going to disappear as most of us shift towards electrical vehicles, improving the recognition across state borders of occupational licensing, so that if you qualify as a tradesperson or a professional in one state, you can work in another without having to jump through a succession of hoops. Those sorts of things are ideas that have been around for a long time, but have always faced blockers of one sort or another. I think the roundtable has given those who need to make decisions about these things more room to push on and pick, as the management consultants like to say, some low-hanging fruit. And then third, I think the roundtable has given the government license to talk about more aspirational reforms to our tax system that they didn't get at the election because they didn't ask for them. I think it's a fair reading of Australian history to say that governments can't embark on ambitious reforms to the tax system or anything else that might make some people worse off unless they've told the people at an election campaign that that's what they're going to do. And because he's an instinctively cautious politician to begin with, but also because he was part of a government 15 years ago that, having said it would never introduce a carbon tax, and then immediately after gaining election did precisely what he had said it wouldn't do, thus setting up one of the most devastating opposition campaigns against it that Australia's ever seen. I think Anthony Albanese is determined that he's not going to make that mistake again. And so the government's mandate for reform of our tax system coming out of the election held in May this year was incredibly narrow. Approving the tax cuts that were legislated on the eve of the election, increasing tax on superannuation funds that are bigger, or superannuation balances that are more than 3 million, and some form of road user charging. That was all that was on their agenda. Now, I think there's an awareness in business and political circles, though not necessarily across the entire community, that Australia's tax system is in need of fundamental repair for a whole lot of reasons, including the adverse impact it's having on economic growth, productivity and investment, but also because, as people argued at the roundtable, it's increasingly unfair, especially from an intergenerational perspective, and because it isn't raising enough revenue to pay for the spending that the public very clearly wants on health, age, disability and childcare, or which the political class agrees that the public's going to get whether they want it or not, such as on defence. And so the kind of tax reform Australia needs has to be bold, has to be ambitious, and probably has to make some people worse off, unlike Howard's tax reforms of 25 years ago, which did make everyone better off because the Howard government was sitting on a big budget surplus that they could draw down to make sure that everyone was better off, in contrast to the decade of deficits that we're looking at, not just at the federal level, but the state government level at the present time. So what I hope is that between now and whenever the election is held in presumably the first half of 2028, the government will feel emboldened to have a series of what psychologists call adult conversations with the Australian electorate with a view to securing a mandate for ambitious tax reform that the government, which given the size of its majority in this parliament, is likely to be re-elected in 2028, which the government can then do in its third term. And yes, people will say, why can't we do it now? Because the country needs it now. The political reality is that that's not going to happen without having an electoral mandate. So my third observation about the roundtable is that I think it has cleared the way in the way that the election itself didn't for the government to start talking about and hopefully eventually implementing the kind of tax reforms that would make a real difference to productivity, to economic growth and investment, and to the kind of society that most Australians, I think, would like to see.
2 points. First, with the productivity changes, these will take time, a long time. That's 1 point. Secondly, there's an interesting claim or push by Chris Murphy, who's an economist working for the Productivity Commission, saying we need a system where state property stamp duty would be abolished, GST-free items such as private education would be taxable, and most small businesses would no longer be exempt from payroll tax, and personal income tax would be slashed by $43 billion a year. Now, I think that's all pretty good, but going on what you're saying, it would seem that the government could perhaps start a conversation around this as part of their 2028 tax platform.
Well, yes, and I hope they will. I've seen the modelling work that Chris Murphy has done, and I agree with a lot of what he's proposing. One of the things that his work underscores is the importance of the states and territories being part of the conversations we need to have about tax reform. Because as you noted there, he's talking about, as others have done, payroll tax, which is a state tax, and stamp duties and land tax, which are also state taxes. And he's right to say, as other studies have done, that reforms in these areas offer some of the biggest potential gains, not just for economic efficiency and things like that, but also for fairness and equity. And so it's right that these things, which are complex and which will necessarily require decisions to be taken by 9 governments, not just one, but 9, including the 8 states and territories, that's going to take time to be done. And, if it's not endorsed by an electoral mandate, then some future government is going to say it's illegitimate and seek to reverse it, as happened, for example, with the carbon tax. So that's very important. One particular complication with any changes to the GST, including not just broadening the base of it, as Chris Murphy and others have suggested, but also increasing the rate of it, which I have a fair bit of sympathy with, is the fact that the revenue from it is, under current legislation, assigned to the states. And so there's a political problem in that no federal government is going to wear the political odium of raising the rate of GST and the financial burden of compensating a third of the population, pensioners, others, for the impact of doing that on them, while the states get all the political kudos for spending the additional revenue. The nexus between payments to the states and revenue from the GST is going to have to be broken in some way. And that's going to take time to convince people to approve as well.
And you've got issues like Western Australia getting a huge share of the GST.
Well, that's another reason why I wouldn't support broadening the base or raising the rate of the GST at the moment, because Western Australia would get a bigger share of it under current arrangements than it should be getting. And I would like to think that that'll be part of the conversation as well. I mean, bear in mind that under the legislation that established what I've called the worst public policy decision of the 21st century so far, the Productivity Commission's required to undertake a review of those changes before the end of 2026. And as I think I've said with you before, and certainly in other places, there's an opportunity for the federal government to task the Productivity Commission with not simply ticking off that outrageous decision, but instead coming up with ways of achieving the goal of what the Boffins call horizontal fiscal equalisation, that is, distributing the revenue from the GST or whatever other general purpose payments the federal government makes to the states and territories in a way that allows them to provide similar standards of services to their people whilst levying on them similar burdens of state taxation. That objective, which over the last 90 years has, I think, made Australia a better country than other federations, and in particular the United States, where it matters an enormous amount as to the quality of schooling your kids get, the quality of healthcare you get, the quality of policing that your community gets, which which state you live in. I would like to think that the Productivity Commission could be tasked with identifying ways of achieving that objective that are much simpler, easier to understand, and more predictable than the one that's evolved over the last 90 years.
So all up, we're talking about any changes coming from the roundtable will take, if they happen, they'll take many years, at least 3 years.
Well, yes. And, that's part of the effects of living in a democracy rather than having these things unilaterally imposed by some kind of dictator. But, I'm talking in that context about major changes to the tax system. As I said, I think the Productivity Roundtable, the Economic Reform Roundtable, as it's officially called, has, I think, sped up the process of implementing a whole series of smaller changes to things like red tape around construction and paying for roads and recognition of qualifications that have been talked about but little done about. I think we can see quicker action on those, and some of those might produce some results within the life of the current parliament. Now, when it comes to productivity, of course, you need to see improvements over longer periods of time than 2 or 3 years to be assured that they're sustainable, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think in respect of these relatively small steps, again, the outcomes from the Economic Reform Roundtable in Canberra last month, despite in some cases being small, nonetheless welcome and positive.
And all the rest will take time, and we just need patience.
Well, yeah, and as I say, it's easy for idealists like me, or people who write editorials in the Fin Review and in other papers, to say, we've been dithering for 20 years, why can't we do it now? And I guess in the grand scheme of things, another 3 years isn't a huge increment to that. And if being patient, having adult conversations with the electorate and gaining electoral mandate means the governments can be more ambitious and that the changes they make are unlikely to be overturned by a subsequent government of a different political persuasion, then I think those extra couple of years are probably worth the wait.
Indeed. Well, Saul, it'll be fascinating to watch, and thank you very much for your time.
That's a pleasure.
So what's happening in the news? Well, the blockbuster war in the Murdoch family over the future direction of News Corp and Fox Corporation has been settled. So what's the deal? Rupert Murdoch has agreed to sell billions in shares and give them to 3 of his children in exchange for Lachlan Murdoch retaining control. The agreement ends a bitter succession-style dispute that had pitted the Murdoch siblings against each other in an American court, and it means Rupert's media outlets are likely to retain their right-wing bent after his death. In a statement released on Tuesday morning, News Corp announced a long-running legal dispute over the Murdoch family trust had been resolved. Rupert and Lachlan had attempted to change the terms of a family trust, gave 4 of his children, Lachlan, Prudence Mutaclade, Elizabeth and James, equal voting rights when he died. The fear was that when Murdoch patriarch, now 94, died, Lachlan's siblings would vote to kick him out of the trust, jeopardising his leadership of both media companies. Lachlan is executive chairman of Fox Corporation, which owns Fox News, and chairman of News Corp, which owns newspapers including the Wall Street Journal, the Times, the Australian, Sydney's The Daily Telegraph, and a majority stake in property platform REA Group. The family, which has built a media empire spanning several continents over 70 years, will create 2 new trusts to settle the dispute, the statement said. Lachlan and his 2 younger siblings, Grace and Chloe Murdoch, will be members of one trust, while Prudence, Elizabeth and James will each have their own trust filled with the proceeds of roughly 14.2 million News Corp Class B shares and 16.9 million Fox Corporation Class B shares. Class B shares are those with voting rights. Those Class B shares give them real voting power, unlike Class A shares, which are essentially passive investments. However, unless the trusts act in concert or challenge Lachlan's leadership, he retains centralised control, especially if the Murdoch family trust remains aligned with him. Rupert only needed to convince one of his 3 unhappy children to agree to a deal for the united front they held to collapse. That's the mechanics of the current Murdoch trust. So a peace deal doesn't necessarily mean playing happy families. It sees Elizabeth, James and Prudence being paid out $1.1 billion each. The deal secures Rupert Murdoch's legacy as a founder of the world's most powerful conservative media empire. The insistence in the News Corp announcement that after the deal closes, that none of the departing beneficiaries will have any interest directly or indirectly in News Corp or in Fox Corporation gives a hint of the bitter feelings here. Not only are Prudence, Elizabeth and James out, they'll have to stay out. The departing beneficiaries will be subject to a long-term standstill agreement preventing them and their affiliates from acquiring shares of Fox and News Corporation and taking certain other actions with respect to the companies. So the deal secures Lachlan's leadership of the media companies, which is what Murdoch wanted. But his siblings get voting rights. So what happens when 94-year-old Rupert, still chairman emeritus of News and Foxcorp, dies? That's no longer a question or even a risk. It's a Lachlan show. He's a chairman of both companies. He's got voting rights on the family's remaining investment, about 1/3 of News Corp B class shares, which is the voting class, and he's got the financial disclosure to make sure he's aligned to investors. Once the dust settles, Lachlan's camp will control about 33.55% of News Corp's voting shares and 36.15% of Fox's, plus tiny stakes in the non-voting shares. The Murdochs are selling precious voting stock because they had already sold almost all of the non-voting shares the trust once held to finance earlier family peace deals. The sell-down has reduced the family voting stake in Fox from 42.7% to 36.2%, and the News Corp stake is down from 40.2% to 33%. That's the lowest stake the Murdochs have held in the empire in decades. If a raider wants to make a run at the group's most valuable arm, REA, then 33% of News may not be enough to cement Lachlan's control. The other jewel in Lachlan's crown is Fox News, which is a powerhouse that produced much of the US $3 billion in profits that Foxcorp's cable networks churned out in the last year. Servicing the new debt in the family trust will make Lachlan even more beholden to keeping Fox News subscribers on side, following their remorseless moves further to the right. With a US $2 billion debt to service, Lachlan doesn't have the room for expensive mistakes that alienate Fox News subscribers. It's great for News Corp's Australian shareholders to have the drama sorted. However, the lingering question is whether it's also buying for News Corp chairman Lachlan at a time when traditional media and information businesses such as News Corp are pressured by technology, fragmentation of the media, a rise in automation and artificial intelligence. That's now all Lachlan's pressure, not his selling siblings. While Lachlan comes out of this the winner, the deal leaves the Murdochs' hold on News Corporation and Foxcorp looking more vulnerable than it has been in decades. And then there is the Wendy Deng wild card. There is no payout for Deng's daughters, Grace and Chloe, in the family peace deal. They'll be stuck in there still with no control. Together, they are entitled to 1/3 of the assets in the family trust, even if they can't vote on decisions. In Murdoch world, trust beneficiaries only come of age when they turn 30, but as beneficiaries, they could possibly derail this deal, or rather, their guardians and trustees could. That would be Rupert Murdoch and Wendy Deng. It's reported that Rupert reached out to his ex-wife to accept the deal, and Deng agreed. No doubt she had her reasons, or her price, but unlike the fallout elsewhere in the family, we're unlikely to discover what that was. That's so Wendy. And a federal court ruling that could result in a near $1 billion one-off hit to Woolworths and Coles is likely to result in fewer staff being put into salaried roles, undermining secure employment for workers. But it has implications for all retailers. Bunnings, JB Hi-Fi, McDonald's, Hungry Jack's and KFC will need to examine whether they're paying staff correctly and could face a wave of new class action. The warning came after the country's two biggest supermarkets told investors to inspect bills into the hundreds of millions of dollars to remedy a growing underpayment issue, with Woolworths alone expecting the additional cost of remediation could reach $500 million. The estimates follow a federal court ruling on Friday that Woolworths and Coles had not properly recorded overtime for up to 28,000 salaried managers, dating back to 2013, and relied too much on rosters. The decision, Woolworths said on Monday, would require significant and widespread changes to accepted retail practice for thousands of businesses. Store managers working longer hours than rostered were allegedly underpaid their rates and penalties as well as overtime. The court found Coles and Woolworths failed to keep complete records. Almost 9,000 Coles staff at Coles and 19,000 at Woolworths considered in the ruling. The retailers' failure to complete records meant under tougher laws effective from 2017, they bore the onus to disprove additional underpayment claims brought by the Fair Work Ombudsman and a class action from Madeiro. On Monday, Woolworths said its preliminary review of the decision meant it expected a one-off before tax charge of between $250 million and $470 million. After tax, that would range between $180 million and $330 million, including superannuation and payroll tax. Woolworths expects the after-tax liability to be as large as $530 million, which comes on top of the $486 million already repaid. In total, Woolworths could pay over $1 billion. Woolworths Group estimate of further potential liability includes an assessment of the impact on all salaried store team members, primarily relating to the court's ruling on set-off provisions, minimum breaks, and the treatment of leave in relation to overtime, the company said. The estimate includes further remediation related to historical underpayments from 2013 to 2019, and the impact of the ruling on set-off from 2019 to 2025. The impact on rival Coles was expected to be big too, given it paid back staff only a fraction of Woolworths had. However, Coles has since told investors it estimates a bill of between $150 million and $250 million, including interest and costs such as superannuation, to resolve the underpayment issue. That is on top of the $31 million that is already paid, taking its total to almost $300 million. But Adiro class action principal Rory Markin questioned Coles' provision and estimated that the supermarket's bill could eventually total $500 million. In our experience, employers frequently underestimate the ultimate cost of remediation programs, he said. With Coles, for example, we've acted for hundreds of employees who report that payroll records bear little resemblance to the reality of the employment. The fallout from the 200-page judgment will be wide, according to the Australian Retail Association, the industry's main lobby group, which said the cost and compliance burden on businesses of all sizes was likely to rise and both undermine productivity and hurt career opportunities. The ARA Chief Executive, Chris Rodwell, said this judgment is likely to impact the future distinction between hourly paid and senior salary employees and create heavier burden for businesses. And Australia is trapped in a catastrophic public policy stalemate over a $5 billion a year tobacco black market and underworld war, spawned by years of steep cigarette tax increases that gifted the most roll gold opportunities for organised crime in the nation's history. The escalated crisis has seen Treasury downgrade expectations for the tobacco tax take by nearly $7 billion, despite the excise to increase to about $28 per packet, a 75% rise since 2019. That tax represents more than half of the cost of an average 20-pack of cigarettes, which is selling at between $35 and $50 compared to $13 and $18 on the black market. We're running out of time to fight off this black market, Rich Insight founder and leading economist Chris Richardson warned. Every scrap of evidence from around the world is the longer a black market is in place, the harder it is to stop it. We've offered the most roll gold opportunity for organised crime that I can think of in Australian history. It's a failure on health, it's a failure on tax collection, it's a failure on the fight against organised crime. And we know this, the numbers are screaming exactly this at us. New South Wales Premier Chris Minns on Sunday said the federal tobacco excise was to blame for a surging black market in his state and urged common sense discussion on the issue. I just think this is plainly ridiculous to suggest that if you jack up the price of legal cigarettes, you haven't contributed to the explosion in the black market, Mr Minns told Sky News. Taxing rates have increased, they haven't decreased. This would be the only tax in the world where it's doubled, but the rate of revenue collection is halved over the same period of time. Something obviously is happening here. And Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called for corporate Australia to back up Labor's climate change agenda as the government prepares to unveil a crucial 2035 emissions reduction target and attempts to reset a fraught relationship with the country's biggest businesses. In a speech at the Business Council of Australia's annual dinner, Albanese warned that a political fight over decarbonising industry could damage the economy and laud efforts by business to reduce emissions. Business has seen firsthand the damage done to Australia's international relationships and to our economy by the ideological conflict of the climate wars, Albanese said. A decade in which energy policy became untethered from reality, where even as 24 of 28 Australia's coal-fired power stations were announcing their timeline for closure, there was no coherent plan to replace them. Business and industry don't have that luxury of pretending change is not occurring. You have to deal with the real world. The speech is the latest attempt to reset ties for the government, which has seen its relationship with business sour after the introduction of industrial relations changes that disadvantage employers, including the reintroduction of industry-wide bargaining and a crackdown on labour hire. While opposed on industrial relations issues, the government hopes to find an ally in business as it finalises its climate policy, which will include the announcement of a 2035 emissions reduction target. Labor is thought to be considering a target range of between 65 and 75% based on preliminary scenarios proposed by the Climate Change Authority. It has been besieged by climate activists and green groups pushing it to commit to the upper end of this range, while others have urged the government against what they describe as an impractical high target. When it came to power in 2025, Labor legislated a 2030 target of reducing emissions by 43% on 2005 levels. It also wants 82% of power to be generated from renewable sources by the end of the decade, although modelling suggests it will not meet that until 2037. The government wants to ultimately reach net zero emissions by 2050. The business community is pushing for clarity on long-term policy settings so it can invest with confidence, but it's all over the place like a mad woman's breakfast over where the target should be. A group of businesses led by software giant Atlassian and iron ore heavyweight Fortescue in August published its own modelling, arguing for the substantial economic benefits of a 2035 target of at least 75%. The BCA last week also released its own modelling that stopped short of recommending a number to the government, as it manages a membership base including banks and miners that have mixed views on how ambitious the government should be with emissions reduction. The BCA instead provided a ground-up analysis of the potential costs and policies required to get to 50, 60 and 70% of reductions over the next decade. The report argued that the bulk of emissions reductions would need to come from the industrial, electricity and resources sector. A target higher than 70% would risk harming competitiveness, it said. A 2035 climate target north of 60% will require more than $400 billion in new capital investment from government and industry. And despite being on the brink of bankruptcy as a result of court proceedings, embattled former Liberal staffer Bruce Lehrmann has lodged legal action against the head of a corruption watchdog and federal minister. The legal action was filed by Lehrmann personally under the classification of a judicial review, which asks the court to review the legality of a governmental decision. Lehrmann has filed proceedings against the Commissioner of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, Paul Brereton, and Federal Special Minister of State, Don Farrell. The nature of the proceedings is unknown as of Monday afternoon. Lehrmann entered into national consciousness after he was accused of raping his colleague Brittany Higgins inside Parliament House in 2019. He's denied the claims, which remain untested in a criminal court, after a 2022 trial in the ACT was abandoned because of juror misconduct. But the federal court found in 2024 the allegations he raped Higgins were proven on the balance of probabilities, which was a lower civil standard of proof than its criminal counterpart. Lehrmann's appeal against his defamation loss to Network 10 and journalist Lisa Wilkinson was heard by a panel of judges in August. Justices reserved their decision to be delivered at a later date. He claimed he was defamed by Wilkinson's 2021 interview with Higgins on the project, in which Higgins alleged she was raped. Justice Michael Lee found the allegations were likely true in his headline-grabbing judgment in April 2024. Having escaped the lion's den, Lehrmann made the mistake of going back for his hat, the judge quipped at the time. And that's it for this week.